Hi, my name is Catherine Lee, and I will be presenting my final research project for SISU 306, titled A Comparative Case Study of Proxy Interventions and Conflict Outcomes in Sub-Saharan Africa. During this presentation, I'll be going over my research puzzle, literature review, methodology, my main findings, and my conclusion. And to the right, you can see a map of Africa with Angola in green and Congo in orange. The two cases I focused on were the Angolan Civil War, which lasted from 1975 to 2002, and the Congo Crisis, which was from 1960 to 1965. I chose these cases because the two conflicts took place in relatively similar geopolitical conditions, both being involved in Cold War superpowers and recently decolonized states, but their conflicts ended very differently. As you can see, Angola experienced nearly three decades of conflict, while Angola was resolved much more quickly, only in five. As you can see, this led me to my research puzzle, which is I am proposing to research the role of external powers and proxy wars in Africa because I want to find out why the Angolan Civil War experienced a prolonged conflict while the Congo crisis was resolved much more quickly, in order to help my reader understand how different forms of external intervention correspond with conflict outcomes. Moving on to my literature review, I split my literature up into three conceptual groupings. My first one being external intervention theories and strategies. This really looks at how states, especially great powers, decide how deep and long term how deep or long term they will be in a foreign conflict. We talked about it in class with Elizabeth Saunders, who frames this as a distinction between transformative and limited intervention. But the key difference here is how much outside actors try to manage and reshape a country's internal political system versus managing it from the outside. This grouping also includes principal agent theory, which explains how proxies sometimes act independently and not always in line with their principle. But a lot of scholars also argue that this model oversimplifies the real power dynamics happening in proxy conflicts. This grouping also goes into Cold War specific dynamics like plausible deniability, which is the idea that powerful states, especially during the Cold War, often acted behind the scenes while publicly denying their role. The second group goes towards regime types. This is about how a country's internal politics can make it more or less vulnerable to conflict and outside influence. This literature really emphasizes the role of democratic institutions and elite access to state power. The two main ideas that stand out here are horizontal inequalities, meaning inequalities that exist between identity groups or ethnic groups, which can really fuel exclusion and unrest. And finally, resource curse, which is the idea that countries rich in natural resources often end up with more corruption, authoritarianism, and conflict, especially when those resources are controlled by a small elite. This concept also really connects with economic development, as not sharing and distributing these resources correctly does cause hindrance in development. The third group dives into more economic development itself, and it's not so much the money the country has, but how much the money is used and distributed. And it's not so much about GDP, but it's really about who controls it, whether the public institutions are strong enough to deliver services, and how equitable and benefits there are. Moving on to methodology, this project uses a small comparison case study based on George and Bennett's structured focus comparison model and process tracing, as well as Mill's method of difference. My first hypothesis is in a comparison of proxy war conflicts in Africa, a combination of low democracy capacity, high levels of inequality, or elite controlled democracy, and a weak institutional accountability is sufficient to result in prolonged civil conflict and casualties. My second hypothesis is a comparison of proxy wars and conflicts in Africa, a combination of transformative intervention strategies, Cold War geopolitical pressures, and conceded power to regime-aligned actors is sufficient to align and to result in prolonged conflicts and casualties. I used a mix of archival diplomatic materials, including presidential memos, internal telegrams, and UN records, to really analyze these three key variables. And if you see to your right are my causal models for each hypothesis. Moving on to my operationalization of variables, this is my case comparison table. Starting in the first one with Angola, it's classified as a transformative intervention. And this doesn't just involve the arms and funding, but there also are elements of regime engineering and the use of plausible deniability to conceal the amount of involvement. In terms of regimes, there's a really low level of democracy, and economically, Angola has a medium development, which this label is a little deceptive, as while the country is really rich in oil and diamond wealth, the gain that were unequal and concentrated in elite hands makes the same really vulnerable to elite capture and foreign manipulation. The Congo crisis is classified as a limited intervention, and the U.S. was involved, but primarily support was through support of the UN operations and diplomatic back channels. Democracy in the Congo during this period was really fluctuating. While there was really early efforts towards constitutional government, weak institutions and elite governments made the political system highly unstable. Finally, development was low. Evidence of this is that the state couldn't meet basic needs and ultimately shaped how the US involvement and the regime outcome came out to be. Going through my main findings, I first found that the US intervention, be it transformative or limited, directly influenced the conflict outcome in both cases. The support wasn't just tactical, it was a reflection of a larger geopolitical goal to prevent Soviet alliance governments from taking a hold in Southern Africa, in contrast to the US response in the Congo crisis, which was limited to broader strategic emphasis on UN leadership and economic stability with diplomatic caution. Going into my second key thing would be plausible deniability. Typically in my study, this would have been a strong indicator of transformative intervention. But what's interesting is that plausible deniability also appeared in the Congo, though it was for a completely different reason. In Angola, it was used as a signal for Cold War strength and asserting of US credibility, while in Congo, it was about avoiding escalation, protecting the UN legitimacy, and maintaining international appearances. Especially public transparency during this time was constrained due to the geopolitical environment, and communications had to be made in indirect ways due to so many people involved. The third would be that low democracy capacity in both cases made it easier for foreign actors to influence outcomes. In Angola, the MPL suppressed competition, and in Congo, weak institutions meant that Mobutu faced little domestic resistance. Finally, the fourth grouping is that underdevelopment played a central role of each conflict. In Congo, the economy was collapsing, teachers weren't being paid, and export revenues were vanishing, while internal memos show that the US and the UN really were prioritizing currency reform and tax reintegration. While these tools weren't, I wouldn't say regime engineering, they were more used to prevent collapse of the state. Moving on to my conclusion to wrap it up, I wanted to highlight a few of the most important takeaways from this project. The first being that the intervention time alone isn't enough to explain outcomes. We have to analyze it in relation to domestic political and institutional conditions. A transformative intervention in one weak democracy will have a completely different effect than the same intervention in a more resilient state. Second, I found that the state reinforces underdevelopment and weak democracies don't just invite interventions, but they also shape how that intervention is received and absorbed. In Congo, the economic collapse created dependency on the UN and the IMF, while in Angola, elite controlled oil wealth became a source of violent competition. Finally, the Cold War really created a unique logic of conflict, which I realized while researching, which is one that really blurred the lines between support, control, and sovereignty. The US was often involved without fully acknowledging it, using plausible deniability and diplomatic language to maintain legitimacy while still shaping outcomes. And this is especially true in Angola. That being said, there are some clear limitations to the study. The archival records is dominated by US sources, and there's so many of them, which really limits the voice and perspectives available from other actors such as Congo or Angola or the Soviets. Second, that this was a small and comparison study, which means that my findings aren't meant to be broadly generalized, but rather being deeply explanatory of these cases. Third, my assessments of democracy and development, which were mostly qualitative indicators, while insightful, are inherently subjective and complex. And looking ahead, I would say that this research really opens doors to several new questions, such future researches such as ethnic and regional fragmentation, especially in countries like the Congo, where internal divisions played a major role in shaping both domestic governance and foreign intervention. Thank you so much for listening to me today, and I hope you have a nice day.